Recording in progress.
January 3rd, 2022, meeting of the Eastham Select Board and the Eastham Finance Committee.
Yeah, and I call the Finance Committee to order. All of us are here, Mr. Chairman, so turn
Fantastic.
it back to you.
Okay. First thing is public and select board information. Do any of the select board members have anything they would like to speak about?
I don't think so.
Looks like
Oh,
Amy does.
Amy's got her hand up. Amy? Can you
Yeah,
hear
I
me?
just wanted to mention the passing of Jim Goodrich from the transfer station. I'm sure even if people didn't know his name, there's a presence always helpful, and he'll be dearly missed.
There was something wrong with it.
And it was like a frozen spot.
Yeah, you on your same stuff, Amy, because you're like freezing up. You're frozen.
Frozen again?
Yeah, frozen now.
Yeah, you're
Frozen.
frozen.
I'm catching that. I'm gonna check my, I may get bumped out, but I'm gonna check my Wi-Fi connection here.
Okay. All right. Al, Jared, do you have anything?
Buckle up, stay safe, and hopefully this is the last wave of COVID and we can have a good spring and return to normal. Fingers crossed, New Year optimism. Let's try it.
Okay,
Thank you.
I'm with you.
Is there anybody in the public that would like to say anything that is not on the agenda for tonight? Seeing nothing, we'll move on. The first thing we have is a FY23 budget presentation by Jackie and Rich. You're on.
Thank you. I'm going to start, and then it'll be mostly Rich, so don't worry. So, this is my 5th budget cycle as town administrator for Eastham. It seems amazing, but it is. And it is, I think, one of the most important things that Rich and I are responsible for in general, of all the things that we do. I think I wanted to start by saying, I think that we've accomplished a lot together in the last 5 years, and it's been a sort of a high-energy agenda, I think, but we have been able to discuss really difficult problems when we had them. We've been able to talk about, in the beginning, our lack of reserves and our dearth of capital planning and capital funding, and we've been able to figure out ways out of some of those difficulties together. We've made course corrections. We've employed all kinds of new tools, built our capacity, and in general, improved, I think, overall our community services. And then, of course, the past 2 years we've had COVID, and I think we've survived that extremely well for our little community, despite the ups and downs, and really made adjustments to our services based on the needs of people during that very specific time. So, the most important role of the leader is to set a clear direction, be transparent about how to get there, and stay the course. It's a quote that Rich and I chose from Irene Rosenfeld, and she is a CEO retired now, with consistently ranked as one of the 50 best CEOs in global business. She's known for her leadership and attention to some specific principles, and Rich and I were intrigued by these. For her 4 aspects that she thinks we need to pay attention to are people, productivity, organizational purpose, and she adds a 4th, of course, because coming from business, she says portfolio. But I think for Rich and I, it's more the eye on fiscal health and future planning that is our portfolio piece. So I think in budget development this year and in all years, we basically take a look at what the community expects and from us. The orange items, the capital and operating budgets, are sort of the things that we spend most time focusing on during a budget presentation and what I think taxpayers think of when they think of budget development. But it really starts with taking our level of service and deciding, is it adequate? Is it what we want going into the future? Where are the gaps? How are we meeting the community's needs in terms of services? And of course, what do they expect for a level of services? What are they demanding of us? And most of the time, we see that the community does want us to make improvements, does want us to make services more accessible, does want more convenience in terms of online bill paying and all kinds of technology that we've tried to implement over the past few years, and in some ways to provide new opportunities. So in developing the budget, we look at the data, especially past year performance and revenue projections out into the future, and then we take all of that into consideration and think, what's the best way to retain or improve our services, use the capacity that we have built, and always to consider some of those other factors, which is what is the best way to achieve the select board and the strategic planning goals. So what we're proposing in fiscal year 2023, which will start on July 1st of 22 and end on June 30th of 2023, is a level service operating budget. In other words, we are not cutting any services, we are not increasing any services, we are leaving the service level identical to last year, while hopefully providing some improvements and also making a clear choice not to reduce our capacity in any way. We've continued a refinement of our capital plan and of the need to address our long-deferred needs. And that was one of the more difficult discussions I think we had with you guys in 2018 was, we had long deferred building maintenance and how are we going to catch up and project out into the future. And Rich has really worked very hard with department heads to hone and realistically address those deficits and what we need to do over the next 5 years to start to work on those deferred issues and plan for the future. And in order to do that, we have to continue to fund that faithfully. We cannot cut the capital budget. We also have built in targeted assistance for expressed goals. For instance, one of those would be the housing plan. We're continuing progress on our current initiatives. We don't want to in any way backslide by cutting initiatives that take several years to achieve. So we're very careful about that when we're considering budget cuts. And we're continuing to implement the strategic plan and community and select board goals. So now we get into the nitty-gritty.
I guess I'll take it from there. Thanks, Jackie, and thanks everybody for paying attention. It's a lot of detail in here. I apologize for not being able to be there in person. I'm recovering and hope to be out of quarantine later this week. There is a level of detail that you're accustomed to seeing in our budget book, which I will get posted online and delivered to each of you next week. Electronically and in the binders that I set up for you with the capital budget book, which the first draft was out last month. So that draft with some very minor adjustment is what's presented here for the capital budget. And then that was the first time you're seeing the first draft of the operating budget, as well as the first draft of what we call other budget items. And those three things all told, pulled together our total general fund budget for FY23. And as you can see here, the total funding equals the total appropriations, which is a requirement of general law that our budget needs to be balanced. And taking that a step further, I would say that our budget is structurally balanced and structurally sound, meaning that to the extent we've got recurring appropriations, recurring expenses, but those are funded by recurring revenues. And that's largely the operating budget. An example of not that, for example, would be the capital budget. Those are bigger ticket items that don't reoccur every year. They're, not one time, but infrequent type items. And to the extent those are appropriated, those are funded largely by free cash, which is non-recurring revenue. So you notice there's no non-recurring revenue included in the funding the operating budget. The budget reflects requests of departments, as department heads, as Jackie stated, to maintain a level service budget. There's no new positions and no new programs. We did have some requests for both, but we decided not to pursue those at this time. It does give the departments what they need, however, to keep the level of services that they have been delivering up through this past year. There were also some requests in additional funding of some of the expense line items for inflationary and largely inflationary purposes. And in many cases, or some cases, those were nominally accepted and added into the expense budgets. But there's probably, when we get to the appropriation sections, I think it's about 120, 130,000 of requested changes or increases, inflationary increases that we decided to defer on for this fiscal year. And that's important for you to know. But all told, we do think this provides some operational flexibility for our departments to carry out, each of them to carry out their mission. The capital budget, I think, is adequately funded to make continued improvements in the deferred maintenance on town buildings. It does address the select board goals and strategic plan. And specifically, I'm pointing out under other budget items. Not quite clear on this page. Oh yeah, it is under community services. $900,000 to community services represents contribution to housing goals funded from free cash down below, but that 900,000 represents essentially much of the short-term rental revenue that was earned and generated from FY22 that we talked about a few months ago with the year-end FY21 that we talked about with the FY21 year-end presentation. So if you went back and looked at that, you'd see that's the amount of money that was not budgeted but generated by short-term rental receipts during FY21, and we're suggesting that we reappropriate that in this upcoming year for some housing programs. And Jackie and Paul and the Community Development Department have been working on how to put together a housing production budget, which we'll also get into as we go forward towards town meeting. 810,000 of budget items is a continued commitment to maintain adequate reserves. Puts money into the stabilization fund and gets us to a very good spot relative to our percent of our budget. It also puts a nominal amount of money in OPEB to continue funding that plan, and to our injured on duty fund that was started last year. To accomplish all these things, we do maintain the financial management policies that the select board adopted. And to the extent that there's reporting back to you that needs to be done, I'll indicate that under the revenue section when we talk about that. And it does require an override. The property tax, and to summarize, essentially the level of inflation of expenses, including salaries and employee benefits, exceeds the amount of the property tax growth 2.5%, plus about 0.6% of what's called new growth. So we get about a little over 3% of revenue growth, and our expenses are growing at a clip faster than that. And so obviously it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that, you know, in any one year you can do things to accommodate and shift things, but over time on an accumulative basis, it does catch up. And in my way of thinking, it's identifying that, planning for that, and then what's the best way to address that. And so we have a couple comments on that when we get to that section.
Can I ask a question?
So let me just touch briefly on the funding.
Rich, you got a second? Mary would like to ask a question.
Sure.
Rich, in the debt section, do you expect to have any of the Nauset Regional High School involved in debt for 23 or not until later?
That's a good question, Mary, and a good detailed question from the Finance Committee, I would expect. We will have some debt service in FY23, but it'll be on short-term bond anticipation notes, not on a long-term bond issue. And we'll be carrying that in the school district assessment as part of the assessment, as per the regional agreement. And so when we go through the budgets with the Finance Committee, we go through each section. I'll make sure to pull out, and I'll make sure the schools pull out on the education budgets, the amounts of money being assessed for debt. But not a large amount from the high school project in FY23.
So you expect the larger part to be starting in 24?
Maybe not even till 25.
25?
Usually a school project is at least 18 months to 2 years on a timeline, and the financing is lagging from that as well. So the debt section here is not reflective of anything from the schools at this point.
Are you going to be discussing OPEB a little bit later, or should I ask a question about that now?
Why don't we go through the rest first?
Yep, that's fine.
And then I think it'd be a good spot to ask it in a little bit. Okay. On the funding side of things, I broke this down into the 3 general funding sources: property tax, local receipts, or estimated receipts, and other available funds. This shows our calculation of our tax levy. And in order to make our budget balanced, it requires, just keep pointing out to you right here, this override of $500,000. That provides us the flexibility or the ability to raise up to $31,318,000, of which we would anticipate utilizing almost all of that and leaving us with excess capacity of $500.
I have another
It's
question.
been, property taxes represents about 85% of the overall budget. It's historically, the points over here on the left, the lowest third of property tax burden in the Commonwealth. A result of this budget, a $31.3 million of tax levy, would be about $177 increase on the average property, which is about just under 3.5%. And that's largely on the operating budget. The capital and the supplemental budget are funded by one-time sources, free cash largely. There's been no real general overrides, despite adding quite a few expenses and positions over the last several years, for about 9 years. So since 2015, of course, there has been an override, most recently for community support program and for the capital levy funding. And then prior to that was because you added 4 new positions. That was 3 years prior to the last reported here. So there's been a couple of overrides, but for specific items which are continued and are still reflective in the budget. The last general override was in 2015. So this would be the 9th year out.
Go ahead, Mary.
On
Rick-
projections that I've been doing.
Rich,
we-
Rich, Mary had another question, okay?
Yeah, let me just finish this last thought. Based
Sure.
on this, we would expect that, based on the current inflationary and wage pressures, when you schedule this out, we would expect every 4 to 6 years, depending on how things fall, that we would be addressing override issues, which seems to fall in line when I look back with some information that Jackie had from prior years. And I think the way to approach it is nip it in the bud when you identify it. So in other words, we know a big part of our pressures on our expenses are salaries because of what we have to pay to get people. It's only getting harder to do that and more expensive to do that on the Outer Cape. And so instead of getting overrides at the end of contract cycles, for example, perhaps you get your overrides in conjunction with approval of contracts at the beginning and steward those funds to make sure that you've got the funding to get you through the life cycle of employment contracts, as for example. So, Mary, go
Rich,
ahead.
Rich, how concerned should we be regarding the fact that the excess levy is only $503?
But it doesn't bother me at all, as long as you've got other reserves, and we do. Most communities on the Cape, I don't know if I should say most, but many communities and most communities across the Commonwealth are pretty much use their levy right up to the hilt, or something close to it. And there's actually some reasons for that. And if you're leaving money on the table, for example, going into collective bargaining, one of the only reasons you have to, if you have to go to arbitration to say that you can't, is your ability to pay. It's hard to say you don't have the ability to pay if you're sitting on $500,000 of levy capacity, for example. So there's a number of reasons why to utilize it. If we had no stabilization fund, if we had no provisions for overlays and abatements, if we didn't have any finance committee reserve fund, if we didn't have a good finance committee that provided for budgetary adjustments during the year and for year-end adjustments, if we didn't have some flexibility within the operating budget from which to fund shortfalls and shift money with an approval from the select board and the finance committee, then I might say we should have something in our excess levy. But we do have all these things. We're in a pretty enviable position. And so I think, as Jackie was speaking here, we want to try to maintain that to a large degree. It does give you the flexibility and the ability to do the things that you have been doing for the last couple of years and are wanting to do in the next couple of years.
One question?
Jerry's got a question. Go ahead, Jerry.
Yeah, Rich, a question looking at your 4 to 6 years continual need for a general inflation general override due to inflation. We've come through a period of significantly low inflation, and maybe that's a good reason for the nine-year wait, but how confident are you that it's 4 to 6 years, it's not going to be shorter than that? I mean, I think the fear I have in looking at, and I looked at things beyond this slide, every department is up over 4% increase, and there are a lot of reasons for that, and it's not, that's not a dump, but we're looking at a situation where we have this proposition that's stuck at 2.5% from who knows how many years ago. It's long before I moved to Massachusetts, but it just seems as though I think the fear I have is we're going to come back for general overrides starting much more rapidly than 4 to 6 years. I mean, I'd like to have it extend beyond that, but how confident are you or Jackie on the 4 to 6 year estimate?
Well, it's a good question, Jerry, and I guess the answer is it depends, unfortunately. It depends on what position the select board and this select board and this finance committee wants to take and how to structure things. So, in my mind, I know it's not a small amount of money, but relative to the budget and relative to how things go, 500,000 is a relatively small override. And if you were to do a relatively small override now and follow my potential suggestion of overrides when you approve contracts, employment contracts at town meeting, then I think those employment contracts are generally going to run 3 years, full years. And things happen within those times. So you raise revenues, you raise fees, state aid goes up or may go down. And so if you're going with small routine overrides for things that make sense or people understand, like collective bargaining agreements when they're up for approval, I think the 4 to 6 years is reasonable. There's another approach though. The other approach is not to do that. And I don't want to, it almost makes it sound pejorative. I guess it kind of is, but it's the bury your head in the sand approach and don't do things because you're afraid to ask for the override. And then what ends up happening is after a number of years, you go for a big one. And so I guess, maybe you could go more than 6 years, Jerry, if you tried that approach. I don't know that that would be how I would recommend you move forward, but ultimately it's the finance committee and the select board that recommend to town meeting, and it's town meeting that has to decide. So it's not my call, it's just my experience and information that I provide to you.
Good.
And then you guys get to decide how we move forward on it. But a
Thanks.
small routine approach versus a big ticket approach
Right.
are two different ways of going.
Just as curiosity, oh, Jackie, I'm not going to, go ahead, Jackie.
No, I actually wanted Rich to explain a little bit about, I think when we use percentages, it gets dicey because a percentage increase in the budget, in the expense budget, is not the same as a percent increase for the total levy of the town, right? So, Rich, can you explain the 2.5% as a measure, as a benchmark, as a...
Well, it's what state law since 1980 has provided us. It's kind of an artificial measure of increasing taxing ability. And we got stuck, it's been a while now, it's been 40 plus years. But you got this artificial measure of 2.5% added to whatever your levy was back in 1980. And you get to add what's called new growth. So as you see, over the years, we've got up to over 24.1 million, 2.5% of that's $602,000. We get to add any new development in town. In our case, it's a pretty paltry sum of about 0.6%, translates to $140,000. So every year you get to go up, your expenses can go up, $750,000. So that's got to accommodate all salary increases, any other increases from vendors for various contracts you might have. So, the longer term contracts, the more certainty you have in contracts helps you manage that. So for example, new growth isn't a bad idea to the extent you can. The towns that tend to do well and have fewer overrides tend to have much higher new growth, somewhere in the magnitude of twice as much as what Eastham has. So anywhere 1.2 to 1.3%. So they get their 2.5 and they get another 1.3%, and that's instead of a 2.5% increase, they get 3.5 to 4% increase in their levy capacity every year, whereas Eastham's basically getting 3.
Yeah.
The only way to counterbalance that is to look at other funding sources. And as you saw in the summary, our funding sources are property taxes, which is the vast majority, our estimated receipts, which is about $4 million, and then other available funds, which are other funds that we can routinely transfer monies from to fund the budget, which is not much at all. So we don't have a diversity of revenue in that regard.
Thank you. Just one final, about how much is 500,000 on the median homes tax bill?
Yeah, so I have it over here on the left. Well, before I get to that, Jerry, let me just read the bottom, and I see Steve has a question too. We're projecting that value is going to go up, and this is all estimated at this point. But if this budget and this levy were to be adopted, we're estimating on values based at about $3.7 billion townwide, that the tax rate would come in somewhere around $8.30, and that the average single-family home is about $613,000, the median being $527, and that the average tax would be $5,091 versus $4,920 this year. So that's $170 increase. Of that amount, of that $170, and this is over on the left-hand side, it adds the $500,000 override adds about 13.2 cents onto the tax rate, which is a cost of about $81 on the average home.
Thank you. I'm sorry I missed that. I apologize, Rich.
No, it's okay.
Steve, you had a question?
I do. Thank you, Art. I come at this issue from the opposite perspective, perhaps, but the 500,000 override is approximately 1% of our budget. 1% is not a lot. I take it you and Jackie have satisfied yourselves that there was no way to find $500,000 in a $40 million budget.
We could always find things, Steve. It's a matter of what do we want to do without.
Well, because there's a price to be paid, not only in the additional taxes, but there's a situational price going for overrides. And if a significant chunk of change isn't coming out of that, then I think it's a fair question to say, is there any place that won't hurt that we could avoid doing an override when the need for the override was only 1% of the budget? The answer may be no, there's no good place here or no revenue opportunity here. And I don't want you to forego important services that you need. But, you know, when I ran an organization, if 1% was at stake, I often did not want to go to my board and ask them for a 1% increase. So I found a way to find it. I'm guessing you don't feel that's there, but I just wanted to ask that question.
No, it's a fair question, and we'll get into the detail. And I should have also let off of, obviously this is a process. So over the next several months, I just got the calendar from Jerry on the email today. We have a slew of finance committee meetings scheduled where we'll be going through the detailed budget by each department. So certainly at those points, Steve, we can discuss that again, and we can discuss it tonight as well. But to start, I guess I'd go with on the revenue side of that, our financial management policies, and I think we had a lot of discussion about it when we talked about the policies and when I've done the year-end review and when I've done the budget update. Basically, the financial management policies say, so obviously, instead of raising property taxes, what if we just raise local receipts and revenues, right, instead of taxes? Would that be better? And the answer would be sure, of course it would be better. But how far do you go to the hilt in your budgeting process? So we know what we collect for revenues, and our financial management policies say we want to be using for budgeted purposes between 80 and 85% of our prior year actuals. And so when I first put the draft together, that's where I tried to land. It didn't work. And so this budget proposal, and when we go through the local receipts section, you'll see uses a little over 86% of our local receipts, which is per our financial management policies. One of the things, once we go over 85%, I'm supposed to notify the select board and the finance committee that we did. And the reason is you want to keep 15% for conservative budgeting purposes in case you do have a downturn, that you have a way to go back. You can't go back to the well once you've had town meeting. Once you've set your tax rate, you can't ask for more tax money for that whole fiscal year. So most towns are at that 80 to 85%. There are some towns that want to do more, and they'll go between and say they want you to use 90 to 95% of your actual. And I guess that's, I get that. In the former community I worked in, routinely did that at 95% because they were sensitive to the tax issue. But over time, that had an impact, and the impact was they did not have free cash to fund other things they wanted to do, which ended up necessitating a need for borrowing, which they also didn't want to do. And so to the extent they did do it, usually they got shot down at the ballot box.
Rich,
Result.
let me be transparent about something that I didn't mention, I should have. My major concern is to avoid pushback on your really important uses of that $900,000 in the community service line. And there may not be any, or we could handle it, and the select board and Jackie and you will be able to navigate it, or I may be too timid about it and worried that there will be pushback. But that's what I'm really concerned with. I'm not trying to nickel and dime you. I just don't want a flavor out there that starts questioning really, really critical needs that you've identified in the budget presentation.
Well, that's a really good point. And when we get to the revenue slide, we'll talk about that. Because when I say we used 86% of our local revenues to fund, of actual collected revenues to fund this upcoming budget, that does not include short-term rental tax. It's still preserving short-term rental tax. So.
And I'd like you to be able to do that.
Mhm.
We could discuss this as the future meetings go on. I don't want to dominate the questioning now. So thank you for your answers, Rich.
The one other little thing I just want to point out on this slide, it's a small comfort, I guess, but we track data for a reason, and it is what it is. Even though our average tax burden is going up, I think we're maintaining relative to our peers and relative to our neighbors, our relative position. But our percent per capita has actually gone down, which is a nice sign. So level of taxation is going up, but apparently, I should say, based on the state Commonwealth of Mass data, our residents' income has gone up more than the rate of our tax increases. So therefore, the percentage of our per capita of property taxes, a percent of your per capita income, has decreased slightly. So.
I have another question, Rich, on the valuation, the property valuation. It's an estimate here, and since that is the property taxes are about 80% of our total budget, do you feel that is a low a low estimate, or the 3.7? I was just wondering what your thoughts were on that, whether that figure might increase given what's been going on with real estate recently.
Yeah, it could. Again, Mary, that's why I was careful when I said this, that this truly is an estimate, and the answer is I don't know. I put that in conservatively. It could be higher, but you'll notice that the prior year went up about 10% from 3 billion to 3.4 billion,
Right.
3.1 to 3.4,
Right.
reflecting the market. And we all know the market went up quite a bit more than 10% last year. And so this is our second bite at the apple to adjust somewhat close to market. So is it going to be another 10% or something a little higher? I don't know. Based on conversations with our assessor, this is what I felt comfortable putting down. All the values are set as of January 1. So we've passed the date. A couple of days ago was the day that your property was valued. But now, between now and the spring and summer, we have to go through a whole process with the State Department of Revenue of actually setting and certifying those values based on market data. So that effort is really just beginning now. Interestingly enough, which is a whole side conversation that we could have another time, but it's not just a straight increase in value. Not everybody's property goes up 10% or 20% or what, right? There's different types and different classes of property. And it'd be interesting to see in our newest data when we go through the valuation process this year, do certain types or classes of property go up faster than other types or classes, which would have the effect of disparate result, an increase to some and not such a high increase to others.
Thank you.
Okay. This is the second funding source. Estimated receipts is the second largest source, making up about 13% of our total budget funding. And as I mentioned, 86.5%, excluding short-term rental receipts, 86.5% of the prior year actuals is what's been used to balance out this budget. This shows our history in summary of our various revenue sources, how much was budgeted in 22 and how much we're suggesting for 23. Excuse me. A couple items of note. Short-term rental excise. There's the 937,000 in FY21, which is being reappropriated into housing plan. FY22, we used 48.8, which is the rental inspector and part-time housing coordinator. And in 23, that amount, so of our 900 grand plus or minus that we're expecting to collect, we've committed already at this point $327,000. Again, for the rental inspector, housing coordinator, and the big addition is debt service on Town Center Plaza. Those are the items coming from short-term rental excise. The rest, if we were to collect another 937,000 this upcoming year, anything in over that 327 would be, a free cash allocation to strategically earmarked for something of special concern to the select board and the community. So, Russ.
Rich, I'm just curious on the cannabis excise and host fees. Is there just not enough information yet to put some estimate in there at this point in time?
Right.
That was my second point. Just like we haven't allocated the short-term rentals, at this point, my understanding was the desire of the board was to not allocate cannabis revenues. We did get a first quarter payment on the excise, and this next month or so, actually, I need to be following up on the host fees, so we get a sense of what that is. So if we needed to, yeah, that was one of the levers we could pull to add revenue to lower. That if we couldn't get an override, is one of the things we could do. But for the time being, just like the short-term rental, we're leaving that be to be allocated once it actually comes in.
Thank you.
It also does not reflect anything related to going from 4 to 6% on the short-term rental, I should add.
Oh, okay.
The additional 2% you're talking about.
Right.
Correct. And so this is that, all this stuff's kind of over on the left here.
Rich,
These are all based on all done on the basis of fees being on the same level as they are currently. We do think that there's some opportunity to raise some fees, and we'll probably be putting some in front of the select board for their approval or at least their consideration in the spring. If those were approved, then these actual amounts would probably come in higher than what they had historically, and we'd start using that and repurposing that in the following year. And this first year would go to help generate free cash. And just a moment on free cash. You'll remember from our FY21 year-end update, from the budget update that I did, and just our general conversations, most recently with the capital budget. The capital budget in particular relies heavily on free cash. And so that is really our lifeblood to being able to get things done. So without free cash generation, it really kind of hamstrings us with a bunch of things. We could always borrow in lieu of having free cash, but it has some limitations as well. And the biggest contributors to free cash are our savings on our estimated receipts and our savings on our departmental operating budgets. So those are kind of the two areas where we make out and generate free cash. So my former community that I worked in typically wanted to be at 95% of their prior year actual, which left them with zero wiggle room in a downturn, and typically left them with a nominal amount of free cash, and all other things being equal.
He's got a question,
So-
Rich.
Yeah,
Yes.
Rich, this is Jerry,
I'm sorry, Jerry's got a question.
yeah, the town center fund, if my memory's right, I presented at the town meeting that the debt service for town center net of lost revenue from taxes, which was not that great, was somewhere around 150,000. Is that still true, or has that number changed from what we as the finance committee told the town at town meeting?
I'm not clear what you just asked, Jared. You said the lost revenue is 150?
No,
or
no, the
debt
lost
service?
revenue was about 14,000, but the total cost, our estimate for the cost of town center to the town was around $150,000, of which about 14,000 was lost revenue, which meant about 136 or 130,000 for debt service. Is that where we're sitting on that, or is that where our
In
estimates
that
are off?
327, I believe, is carrying amount of about 225,000, which would be the gross debt service. Remember, regardless of whether we've got money coming in to pay for it or not, we are required to budget the gross amount. I did not budget any
Revenue.
receipts that we might be getting to offset that debt. I guess under the premise that we're using short-term rental money anyway. So to the extent we collected money from Town Center Plaza that would help reduce that, which we would, it's kind of treating it like short-term rental receipts. But the amount is 225 is what's being carried for debt service on Town Center Plaza.
Thank you.
The area where we have some opportunities to make some increases are a handful. The biggest hitting items would be under solid waste fees, where we think we're not particularly competitive and think we could generate more, which is going to become an issue because we do anticipate those costs to rise as contracts expire. And then on the recreation department, very attractive fees that we have for some of our participation in some of our programs. And we might have an opportunity, while at the same time providing some scholarship for those in need. But we think we have some opportunity to increase some additional receipts there. And so those will be some things that will be likely to be putting in front of you, but I haven't baked them into the budget, maintaining that conservative approach. If you do put them in place, then they will be available to us in the future year. Or if we don't get the override, we'd have to reestimate with those extra amounts. State aid, we're anticipating is essentially flat, just the nominal increase that we've been seeing. That being said, state revenues are coming in pretty high. And so I always remain optimistic, but never seems to come over on local aid. You always seem to get it through some other program, which we aren't as good as getting some of the gateway towns and cities are more successful in getting those extra monies. So nominally funded on the state aid. And finally, we've got our other available funds. And so these are monies that come in that by law or by statute go into a separate fund. And we project these activities out to make sure we've got money and we're pretty consistent with them. I do project to increase these from time to time. And you can see a little bit increase here. But the big ones are the Cable Access Fund, basically pays for our cable operators and equipment. Ambulance Fund, which pays a portion of fire department salaries. And in this upcoming year, we'll continue the payment on ambulance lease payments. So that's a good example of the gross effect of a budget. Gross meaning, grossing things up, not, bad. But in the debt service budget is for the first time, $233,000 for those lease payments that wasn't there before because the prior year was voted as an article, it wasn't in the operating budget. So, but not only is it a kind of an increase in the debt service budget, But that piece of increase is also funded by something other than tax levy because it's funded by this ambulance fund. So we got to keep that in mind, that not all things that show in the Article 2 budget table that we vote at town meeting is contributing to a tax increase because some of the things are funded by other sources. And then, of course, we've got the use for capital, and you notice that free cash is super important here down at the bottom for contributing to reserves. We've done a great job of contributing reserves. And of course, really significantly financing capital items this year to the tune of $2.5 million with free cash. Mary, you had a question about OPEB. It might be a good time to talk about that now.
Yes, I did. I know you mentioned earlier, and I saw that we're putting in a very small amount. I think it's 50,000. I have
Yes.
it, 50,000. Do you know with the situation with the stock market, do you know where we are as far as our liability is concerned? And I'm hoping that has increased the value of the monies that are in the account there. And do you know what it would be if we were to level fund that liability over a period of years?
The answer is yes, the stock market has been good for our fund. I just got, before I ended up having to be out last week, the updated actuarial report. So I got to review that and I will forward that to the finance committee. I think our liability is actually dropped slightly, our OPEB liability. And our funding, based on what we funded before, has gone up about 30%. We need about a 30% return through the Plymouth County OPEB Trust Fund. And so when I send that actual report, I will send the finance committee, also send them the trust fund report on our investment in that, in PCOP is what it's called. Still very nominally funded as a percentage of the total. I guess my approach on my recommendation here was, let's get to where we need to be on our stabilization fund. And so that in future years, we can start weaning ourselves off such significant contributions to the stabilization fund and continue to use it for capital, housing, or any other needs that the finance committee and select board or town decide they want to use it for. And if absent any of that, then we could start throwing more at OPEB. To me, OPEB, we do fund what we need to fund each year on a pay-as-you-go basis, just like everybody else, except for maybe about 4 towns. And it's a issue, that's down the road when we're confronted with lots of issues here today. So it's kind of hard to put a lot of money into OPEB when you got other pressing issues. But that's really your guys' call and the town meeting's call. But to your point, Mary, 50,000 isn't where we want it to be. When you get that report, I'll point out, I don't know what it is off the top of my head, but they'll have a number in there that tells you what the annually required contribution, or the ARC, is. And that will be more than what we pay on a pay-as-you-go basis. Plus I think last year we funded the ARC, the 200,000 that we put in, plus what we paid normally through the budget, just covered our ARC. So I'd anticipate what we're doing now is a little bit under.
Thank you.
And finally, the appropriations, just a little bit of flavor on the appropriations.
Rich,
And this is what
Rich, 1 minute. George has got a question.
Yep.
The county legislature has just started a process of trying to determine how they're going to allocate the American Recovery Fund monies that the county is going to receive. How does anything that Eastham might get out of that allocation process, how, if in any way, does that impact the budget that we're reviewing now?
It doesn't impact the operating budget. I mean, I guess it could. I wouldn't recommend it because those would be one-time funds, right? So we wouldn't want to say, yeah, let's hire, 4 new firefighters for $200,000, let's say, and then we got to keep paying them for, the next 5, 10 years, or however long you think you're going to keep them, and then get a one-time slug of money to get you through 1 year. And then you got a structural deficit going forward because you funded a recurring cost with a one-time source of revenue. So to the extent we are successful in getting funds out of the county's ARPA allocation, likely that is going to supplement our capital budget or perhaps our housing production plan. Those would be eligible uses. So it remains to be seen exactly how that's going to go, but we've got plenty of need, and I'm sure we can find a nice one-time source to receive a slug of money as opposed to balancing an operating budget that just puts us into a problem the next year type of thing.
Mary's got a question.
Yeah, and Rich, I want to piggyback on George's comment about the ARPA funds. And I understand that the Barnstable Board of Commissioners are looking for guidance, advice, thoughts on how that money should be distributed. And they're looking for even individual people to comment on that issue. I was wondering whether it would make sense for a combination select board, finance board to put their thoughts together in response to their request, whether that would make more sense. Not that I'm against individuals commenting, but I'm just wondering whether something like that would would be good to do.
Well, sure, as long as we all agree, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you the sentiment of most people, and so, and I guess I tend to go along with the crowd on this one too, but so don't hold it against me. You can have your own opinion, but I think the process is a little overly complicated that they're contemplating. The federal government already sent us $500,000, our first allocation of $500,000. And we know how that's supposed to be spent, and we're going to spend it just like any other grant fund. And I think the county could probably do the same thing. Just send it to the people that know where it needs to go. They don't need the federal government's identified how it's supposed to be spent, and that's how it's going to be spent. And auditors will audit to make sure it was spent that way. You don't need a process to go through. Just, that's the general consensus. And the Cape and Islands Town Managers Association sent the county delegates a letter to that effect. And I'm kind of hopeful that's what ends up happening. And we know how much money the county got for the town of Eastham and from each and every other town on the Cape. So if there wasn't a county, they wouldn't have gotten it. The towns would have gotten it. So just send the money to the towns, and we'll have to report back to them how it was spent because they're the ones that received the money. But that's just like any other pass-through federal funding. It seems to be the cleanest and easiest way, and then each town gets to decide exactly what's best for them. If the Select Board and Finance Committee wanted to send a letter to that effect, I know they met just before the holiday and probably postponed any further decision on it. So we'll have an opportunity coming up in January to do that if you'd like to. Okay. Finally, on appropriations. This is I'm not going to spend a lot of time because this is what we'll be going through at every single Finance Committee meeting. So I would invite the Select Board to either come to the Finance Committee meetings or watch the videos, as well as the public. If they want to hear what's the detail making up some of these amounts, that's where all the action happens.
Scintillating meetings, Rich, scintillating meetings.
But this is the summary, and this shows the percentage changes from one year to the next, and a breakdown. And obviously, the big hitter here is debt service going up almost 23% from 4.9, almost 5 to 6.1, and that's simply a reflection of bond issuance related to the water project. This is not, however, contributing to the need for the override. Because remember, all this debt is what's called exempt debt. And if you went back and looked at the levy limit calculation, you'll notice that one of the things that gets added to the levy limit any year is any exempt debt authorizations. So as our debt goes up on our water project, our tax levy goes up a like amount. When the debt goes down, because this is expected to peak in 2025, I think it is,
25, I think you said.
and then it starts to drop quite quickly, our ability to raise that money also drops. So you don't get to bank the money and then use it for something else. So if we've got, $500,000 of debt service this year, we're able to raise $500,000 of levy. If we don't have that $500,000 of debt service next year, we don't still get the $500,000 of tax levy. So it's a 1-for-1. So the override, this does not affect the the need for the override. That being said, we do know we have some needs coming down the pike here, or the highway. And if we were to try to time our future debt service and borrowing needs with a drop off in this debt, it seems to be prudent. That's how you get to maintain, hopefully, a relatively stable tax rate. Unallocated is well, I guess the elected in general is the next biggest increase, 22%. All that is I added $25,000 to the Finance Committee Reserve Fund because we did defer on some departmental requests that people thought they needed for some inflationary purposes. So one of the ways to protect against that, and we needed a higher reserve fund anyway. Even if you don't use it, it does go to free cash generation. So percentage-wise, that's a big increase, but all that is going from 100 to 125 on the reserve fund. Otherwise, the unallocated is a big increase. The unallocated is largely due to expected increases in pension assessment, which is a little over 5%, health insurance, which is 10%, and general insurance, which is going to be about 8%. So we can continue to find ways to mitigate those costs, but they kind of are what they are at the moment. But mitigating those costs is kind of a long-term task. Then also community development is up quite a bit. That reflects a full-time salary for housing coordinator is the big change there. That's another example of the overall cost is up, but that position is being funded by the short-term rental receipts. So again, also not affecting the need for the override or the impact on the tax rate.
Question, Rich?
I got a couple of questions, Rich.
On the community development, CPA funds are going to be used, I think, or have been used, and I think the request is going to come in again to help fund for approximately half of that housing coordinator position. How is that reflected in these numbers, that some funding may come out of CPA funds?
Nope, that is a good question, and the answer is no, it's not. It's not that it couldn't, and that might be a discussion we have or a change we have, but at the moment, it's fully borne by the general fund, funded by short-term rental receipts.
Thanks.
And Mary?
And I have a question, Rich, on the fact that, as you've commented, we just don't have any idea at this point on the educational assessments that we're going to be receiving at some point. And do you have any idea on how that might be going, or?
I know Cape Cod Tech is doing well. They're usually ahead of the schedule. I will follow up with the business manager there next week. I think I probably will be able to get a tentative number. NASA, I just don't know, but I'll be opening up those lines of communication next week as well. But I would expect that's the usual March timeline.
Okay, and George has a question.
Rich, in the later on in this presentation, you make or somebody makes the statement that you're anticipating favorable news for general and health insurance. Does
Yes.
that, is it your thinking that the dollars that you put into unallocated expenditures at this time may actually come down with favorable news?
That would be what would happen, right? And, you know, if we get unfavorable news, likewise, hopefully they will be
Well,
offset.
you say you're anticipating favorable news, so that's a little stronger than
Yeah.
just if it does or if it doesn't.
Well, I guess the reason, I do know quite a bit about the health insurance trend. So, you know, Cape Cod has the most expensive health insurance in Massachusetts. Massachusetts is the highest cost, medical cost area in New England and in the country. And the United States is the most expensive healthcare in the world, which makes, so if you trace all that back, Cape Cod's amongst the most expensive medical care in the world. So I've been following this for years, and I participate with the Cape Cod Municipal Health Group, which the town participates, who does a really good job. It's a self-insured medical pool. We don't buy straight Blue Cross Blue Shield insurance. It's a self-insured arrangement, which has given us very favorable rates over the years and has minimized the trend increase, because nationally, medical trend is over 10%, which is why I'm carrying until I know in February what the exact rate will be. But I do know medical trend is over 10%, largely driven by prescriptions. Cape Cod Municipal Health Group in the last couple of years, and again, maybe a COVID pandemic anomaly, has had very, very low rates, mostly due to underutilized programs because nobody was going to the hospital for a while. So we expect that to continue, not as much as it had, but less than, or maybe, less than the 10%. But also because of those couple good years, we do know that, and we're self-insured, to the extent we have good experience, we're able to retain premiums that have been paid in. And so the Cape Cod Municipal Health Group has a surplus. So to the extent we have a higher increase in medical trend, they can utilize that surplus to balance their rate for a couple of years. And so yes, I'm certain that we're going to have good experience on that, but I guess I was holding my fire, not having a lot less level of confidence on their education assessments and a couple of other things.
Roy's got a question.
Rich, the overall increase of 8.02%, that's due primarily to the increase in debt service and also the town expense budget?
Yeah, well, the numbers, if you look at the bottom section there, kind of tell a story, right?
Yep.
Almost 2.6 million, 1.1 is from debt, which is, I guess I could give you the number, what the amount of that, the increase is. But things are going up 2.6 million and debt's 1.1, so that's a pretty good percentage of it. Expenses, I didn't put in here what the drivers of those expenses are. Those are the most likely health insurance, general insurance, and pension obligations are the big heavy hitters. Most things are trending at 2.5% to 3.5%, but those three items in particular are anywhere between 5% and 10% inflationary rates. And then, of course, town salaries are averaging around 5%. Several contracts have built-in increases upwards of 5.5%, but we do get some turnover, which, you know, historically has provided us with quite a bit of benefit. But what almost everybody is finding now when they have turnover is they have to pay just as much, if not more, to attract a qualified candidate to replace the long-term incumbent. So it's a challenge that we face.
Thank you.
This is a summary on the capital budget. We have the capital budget book. I'll get these online next week. But this is just a summary. We are spending almost $3.4 million on the capital budget. Much of it, some of it is funded by other sources. So utilization of a lot of our free cash, but we do get grants in Chapter 90 money from the state, which funds roadwork projects. And the big grant that we're anticipating spending is the Complete Streets program, which is moving forward, and we anticipate being able to make progress on in FY '23. The cautionary tale with the capital budget, it's almost the same as the operating budget, but supply chain issues and availability of product and really the overall bid environment is terrible for maintaining low prices. And so we might be in a scenario where the timing of some of these projects is important, and we want to, we might want to contemplate not moving forward with something because of the cost of doing it now versus, can we get a better arrangement later?